Welcome back, class. We're going to be starting chapter 3. And chapter 3 is called The Molecules of Life. So chapter 1 was a brief overview. Chapter 2 was all about the chemistry of life. Now we're going to go a little bit more advanced in our chemistry and look at the molecules of life. So we looked at a few molecules like water and salt and stuff like that. We're going to look at larger molecules and how they are needed for life. And the first thing we need to do that is know something, and that something is that life is carbon-based. So what does that mean? Life is carbon-based. It means most of the organic molecules, so when we talk about organic molecules, we're talking about molecules that are needed for life. Pretty much the majority of all of them, like 99%, have carbon in them. They use carbon kind of as a backbone. And the reason for this, if you remember when we drew carbon, so let's do that really quick. So we have our carbon. If we look back on our periodic table, we see carbon has an atomic number of 6, which means we know it has 6 electrons. So in its first shell, we have 2 electrons, and then in its second shell, we have 4 electrons. And we talked about how carbon is extremely unhappy because it needs either gain 4 electrons or lose 4 electrons. So because it's stuck in the middle, it usually does covalent bonds where it shares electrons. And because it has 4 valence electrons, it can do 4 bonds all the time. So the one we looked at was with the hydrogens, and they were sharing here to create CH4. Sorry, I don't have enough room there. But what we can also do is add on another carbon instead of this hydrogen. And if we add on another carbon, now, yes, we're doing 1 bond here, but now we can do 3 bonds here and 3 bonds here. So now we can do 6 bonds. If I were to add on another carbon, then I'd be able to do 8 bonds. And so what we end up seeing is that because carbon is like that universal Lego piece, you're able to add things on it on all different angles. And that's why life is carbon-based, because carbon allows it to build upon larger molecules based off having these multiple places where you can do bonds. And so when we look at all of our molecules today, we'll see that carbon is a big part of them. And instead of us drawing it like this, we're end up going to be drawing them like peaks and valleys. And each one of these peak and valley is a carbon. And that becomes the carbon backbone. And so we'll see it like that, or we'll see it like this. And we just know that each one of these is a carbon atom. And then let's say if we want a oxygen and a hydrogen here, we can draw something like that. Or if we want to draw something with like a ring with something like that. And so what we know is that these are larger molecules. So like here, this is a form of alcohol, and this is a form of sugar, that we know that it has all these different carbons that are on there. And so we'll see as we draw these larger molecules, we'll simplify them by not labeling the carbons because we just have this large carbon backbone because life is carbon-based. Now, a very interesting thing, if you were an astrobiologist, an astrobiologist is those that are kind of looking for life outside of our own planet. So here, our carbon is right here, so that's a good 4 space places where it can do bonds, right, on the carbon. And what a lot of astrobiologists will look is for life outside of our universe, or not even our universe, but our galaxy, or even within our galaxy, that is silicone based, because silicone is very similar to carbon where it can do 4 different bonds. Now some of these other elements can also do that, but they're so big that it wouldn't make sense for life to have something that big because it would limit what they could do. So when astrobiologists look for life outside of our planet, they're looking for carbon-based molecules and they're looking for silicon-based molecules because of this idea that maybe silicon could be the life-based model in that universe or that galaxy or that planet or whatever it is. All right, so back to life as carbon-based. All right, so when we're looking at how we create larger molecules, it's something we use two different reactions. There's what we call a dehydration reaction and a hydrolysis reaction. So one is to make larger molecules, and one is to make smaller molecules. So our dehydration reaction what that does is it links monomers together and monomers are single elements or single compounds. So it links monomers together through a chemical reaction that releases water. And so what we have, let's say we have two monomers here. So here's one monomer, and on that monomer it has a hydrogen atom. And then here's another monomer. So these aren't oxygen, so we'll just color these in. And this one has not only a hydrogen atom, but also a hydrogen and an oxygen atom. Now, if we wanted these two monomers to come together to create what we call a polymer, so a bigger molecule, what we would do is a dehydration reaction. And what that does is we would take this hydrogen and this oxygen and hydrogen, we call this a hydroxy group, and we combine those together. They form H2O, so we have two hydrogens and one oxygen, H2O, and then these guys combine together. And so what we've created with this dehydration reaction is we dehydrated, so obviously dehydrated is when you don't have enough water, so we dehydrated these organisms to create water, but and then combine them together. That chemical reaction ended up combining them together. Now we can go the opposite route and break these up by something we call hydrolysis. You can call it hydrolysis. And this is where we use water to break up a polymer. So in other words, we would take this same water that we used, we would come in and use it to break up that polymer, so now that it is back to its original stage. And so this is dehydration, and this is hydrolysis. It's called hydrolysis, but I like to call it hydrolysis because hydro means water, and lysis means to cut or break. And so here, dehydration reaction creates water, so it dehydrates our molecules and creates a polymer, where hydrolysis or hydrolysis uses water to cut, so it breaks that bond and then creates your monomers here again. And we'll see that we'll use this a lot of the times when we're making larger molecules or we need to break those larger molecules down. So our bodies and life does this all the time. which allows it for life to be more complex when you need to build more complex things, or be able to take nutrients out of something that is more complex. And so what we're going to talk about today now are 4 types of macromolecules. And of these 4 types, 3 of them have what we call micromolecules. So macromolecule is something big, something large. A micromolecule is something small. So similar to our monomers, which was just one, or a polymer, which is many. And so our first macromolecule that we're going to talk about is carbohydrates. But before we can talk about the macromolecule of carbohydrates, we have to talk about its micromolecule, which is sugars. And sugars, we often call them saccharides. And then we have what we call monosaccharides. So meaning one. And those monosaccharides will be these ring structures. So we have what we call a hexose sugar and a pentose sugar. So hexo for a hexagon and pentose for a pentagon. And these sugars will have these OH groups off of them. So they look something like this. Now, a lot of time when I draw my sugars, I won't draw all of these because it just makes them a little bit messy. But I just kind of wanted to show you there that in our sugars, we have things like carbons, we have hydrogens, we have oxygens, and that actually becomes really important when we look at metabolism and how we break down sugar, when we'll talk about those in chapters 6 and 7. So with our monosaccharides, like I said, they look like this. They're singular sugars. And we have some monosaccharides that we have in our life. So things like glucose or sucrose or fructose. These are different types of monosaccharides. Now, if we put these together, like if we combine them together, we create a disaccharide. And that's when, so I'll draw these a little bit more simple. That's when you would combine 2 saccharides together. And in this case, if you had glucose and fructose together, you create sucrose. So sucrose is a disaccharide with, like I said, fructose and glucose. And sucrose is our table sugar. So this is the sugar that you would put into your cereal or into the Kool-Aid mix that we were talking about in the previous chapter. And so these are your monosaccharides and your disaccharides. So there's a bunch of different sugars. You probably heard of like lactose sugar, all those different kinds of things. So there's all these different types of sugars, and they can either be monosaccharides, so singular, or disaccharides, where there are 2 together. Now, when we go higher than 2 together, we then end up creating what we call a carbohydrate. And so these are kind of our micromolecules. So micro, and this is our macromolecule. And so our carbohydrate being our macromolecule, is when you put together multiple sugars together. So that would be a carbohydrate when we've linked multiple amounts of these sugars together. So when you usually think of carbohydrates, you often think of things like starches, and like in potatoes, or starches like in your bread and your wheat and stuff like that. And they're made up these carbohydrates. So a very interesting thing, if you think of like a saltine cracker. So a saltine cracker is pretty much just a wheat cracker, and it's made up a bunch of all these little sugars. Now, if you were to take a saltine cracker and start chewing on it and breaking down some of these bonds here, what would end up happening, and if you didn't swallow, if you just kept it in your mouth, that saltine cracker would go from a salty taste, mainly because there's salt on there with the wheat cracker, but eventually it would be broken down into sucrose and different sugars that taste sweet. And so you would have something that tasted salty and plain as that saltine cracker, but then as you broke it down, as you chewed it, it would break down to these individual sugars, and then it would start to taste sweet. So it's interesting that a carbohydrate doesn't taste sweet, but once it's a sugar, and once it gets broken down, it does taste sweet. And that's just how different chemicals interact with our taste buds. So like I said, with our carbohydrates, we have things like starches. And starches are great because they store energy. So when we need energy to move our muscles, to think, to do all the different crazy things that happen in our cells, we usually need sugars to do that. But those sugars get stored in starches in like foods, like we talk about potatoes and wheat. And when we eat those, we can break those down in our digestive system into these sugars so that we then can create energy. And like I said, we'll talk a lot about creating energy and all that kind of stuff in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Another type of carbohydrate is cellulose. So cellulose is what we find in plants. So cellulose in plants makes up its cell wall and things like the bark of a tree. And it's very, very strong. And in some plants, like lettuce and celery and stuff like that, cellulose that makes up their cell wall, what it does is it has a different type of bond. So here we have this bond going up, and then there's another bond that goes down. And if we have a carbohydrate that has this bond that goes down, it's a cellulose, where if it goes up, it's a starch. And the difference is, in our digestive system, we cannot break this bond. We can break this one, so we can break this bond and break it down into sugars and use them for energy. But this is a stronger bond. That's why plants use it for their cell walls and like the bark of a tree and all that kind of stuff. And we can't break this down. But it's still important for us in our diet. We call this fiber. And what fiber does is it actually, so we don't break it down, but it actually will scrape the walls of our intestine and help keep our intestines nice and clean. And so we still need fiber in our diet, even though we don't get any nutritional value out of it. If we have starches in our diet, we can use that for nutritional value. We can break that down to sugar and energy. All right, so that's our first of our 4 macromolecules, which is carbohydrates, and sugar being its micromolecule. The next one we're going to be talking about is the macromolecule fats and oils. Now, fats and oils are interesting because they're only micromolecules. There's no macromolecules that make them up. So they're always, when they're created, they're always the big size that they are. And we have different types of fats. And fats are interesting because what they will look like as a molecule is they'll have what we call this head, and then it will have these tails. And so they kind of look like this. Sometimes you can have a fat with only one tail. Sometimes you can have a fat with 3 tails. And these tails, just like when we first were talking about all our different ways we draw carbon, so these tails are made up of a bunch of carbon and hydrogen. And they call them fatty acid tails. And the interesting about these tails is they make these things what we call hydrophobic. So hydro, once again, is water. And phobic is the fear of. So in other words, hydrophobic means the fear of water. And so these fats and oils don't like to mix with water. And you see this all the time. So if you have like a dressing, and you'll see there'll be a layer of oil and then a layer of water, and you have to kind of shake it and mix it up to actually get them to mix. And the reason why they aren't they're scared of water is because they don't have any type of charge to them. So if you remember, water is a polar molecule from our picture previously, has that positive and negative charge on it, and so it likes to interact with things that also have a positive or negative charge. Well, these fatty acid tails are just carbon, and carbons very rarely have charges on them. And so because of that, these guys are hydrophobic. And another part of our fats and oils are things called hormones. Now, hormones are very big. They often look something like this. And this hormone specifically would be testosterone. And then the interesting thing, if you just switch this OH up to here, then it becomes estrogen. So estrogen and testosterone, even though they're very different in what they do in the body, they are very similar in what they look like. And the main reason why we group hormones and steroids with fats and oils is because these guys are also hydrophobic. Because you see here is a lot of carbons and hydrogens, just like we see a lot of carbons and hydrogens here. And so we like to group these two together based off their property of being hydrophobic. Now they do different things. Fats and oils are mainly used for energy, right? There's twice as much energy in a pound of fat than there is in a pound of sugar. So fats and oils have lots of energy, and that's because a lot of the energy comes from these tails here that get broken off. Where hormones, they're mainly used to signal different things inside the body, right? So you have things like growth hormones. So when you're growing up in your teenage years and when you're young, you have a lot of growth hormone that's released, and that growth hormone goes to all your different cells and let them know, hey, it's time to grow, it's time to develop, it's time to multiply, all that kind of stuff. And so hormones mainly are used as signals for your cells, where your fats are mainly used as fuel. Your fats and oils are used as fuel inside your cells. And like I said, the main reason why we lump these together is because of that hydrophobic, that scared, their fear of water, so they don't interact well with water property that they have. Our next macromolecule, so this is number 2, so number 3 is amino acids. And actually, amino acids are the micro, and the macro is proteins. All right, so let's draw kind of what an amino acid looks like. So amino acids are pretty interesting. They have an amine group and a carboxylic acid group. That's why it's called an amino acid. So here is the carboxylic acid group over here. And then on this side, we have our amine group. And our amine groups have nitrogens in them. And so they look like this here, but then they'll have another part down here. And this is what we call the side group. Now that side group will determine which amino acid that is. So in life, we have 23 essential amino acids. And these amino acids, once they come linked together, will create a protein. And you'll see easily there's an easy spot where amino acids can link together here with this OH and with an H from a previous one. And so what you'll have is these guys will come together to create a bond, and then we'll also have water come from that. So H2O, we'll have water come from that, just like we saw when we did our dehydration reaction here, right? And when you do that, you create what we call a peptide bond. And the reason why we call it a peptide bond is sometimes amino acids can be called peptides. And proteins, which is a combination of a bunch of amino acids, often are called polypeptides. Once again, poly meaning many. And so you make this peptide bond. So as you create more and more of these, you then create your protein. All right, so proteins are very, very important. Mainly proteins make up a lot of who we are. So our muscles are made out of protein. Inside our cells, we have these little machines made out of protein that help do all the cool things that our body needs to do. So proteins are used for structure. They're used for different processes, like the little machines we talked about in our cell. So they do a lot of crazy cool things. And like I said, there are 22 essential amino acids that once they link together create proteins. And we'll talk a lot about proteins when we look at genetics and looking at how do we create, how do we know to build things based off the genetic code, and pretty much the genetic code codes for proteins, and how does that all work. So we'll learn a lot about proteins later on in chapters 9 and 10. All right, so our last macromolecule that we're going to be talking about are our nucleic acids. So this is our fourth. And so we're going to have our nucleotides, which are the micro, and then the macro will be our nucleic acids. Now, nucleic acids, if you haven't heard of them, you really have. These are actually just your DNA and RNA. All right, so these are the things that make up our genetic material. And so our nucleotides are our individual amino acids. And so a nucleotide is kind of interesting because it's made up of actually a little bit of a sugar, a little bit of a phosphate group, and then also your nitrogenous base. And so an amino acid, a nucleotide will look something like this. So that's that's a nucleotide. And in our genetic makeup and our genetic material, we have 5 different nucleotides. We have what we call adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and uracil. So we have these 5, depending on what this nitrogenous space looks like. So there's different shapes for this nitrogenous space, similar to what we saw in our side group for our amino acids. We have different side groups making a different amino acids, our 22. So we have different nitrogenous spaces that create our different nucleotides, whether they're adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, or uracil. And then as we combine these together, we then will create a nucleic acid. And depending on how these nucleotides come together will determine whether it's DNA or RNA. So there are a few differences between DNA and RNA. So we're just going to talk a little bit about those differences. So DNA, when you look at the nucleotide of a DNA, it's going to look like this. And then our RNA, it's going to look very similar, but a little bit different. All right, so the main difference you see here is that on your DNA, you only have a hydrogen here, where on your RNA, you have an oxygen and hydrogen. Oh, let me show you this again. So on your DNA, you only have a hydrogen here, and then on your RNA, you have an oxygen and hydrogen here. And so this is what we call a hydroxy group. And so you're missing that here in DNA. And actually, that's why DNA is called what it is. It's called deoxyribose nucleic acid. So DNA. All right, where RNA is just ribose nucleic acid. So RNA. So deoxy is really just meaning one less oxygen, so to not have it. So it's less oxygen than there is here. That's why it's deoxyribose nucleic acid and ribose nucleic acid. Another way you can usually tell DNA apart from RNA is DNA is usually double-stranded. And that double-stranded is what we also like to call a double helix. All right, so you'll, not all the time, but I would say 90% or more of the time, DNA is double-stranded in a double helix, where RNA most of the time is single-stranded. And then the third main difference between DNA and RNA is which nucleotides they use. So DNA will use adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. So I'm just taking the first letters of each one of these. So adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. And RNA actually uses adenine, guanine, uracil, and cytosine. So in other words, if you're looking at genetic material and you see a thymine, then you know it is DNA. If you're looking at genetic material and you see uracil, then you know that it's RNA. So those are three big differences between DNA and RNA. So once again, DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, so it's missing an oxygen. RNA is just ribonucleic acid. DNA is usually double-stranded in a double helix. RNA is usually single-stranded. And then lastly, the different nucleotides they use to create it. So DNA uses adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, where RNA uses adenine, cytosine, uracil, and guanine. That should be a G there. And then we'll talk a lot more about DNA as well as with proteins in those chapters 9 and 10, looking at how DNA comes together, how it was discovered, all that kind of cool stuff. But the main thing just to realize about DNA is what holds all the information that make up all of living life. So whether you're a small bacteria and you look at your DNA, or you're a advanced human like us and you look at our DNA, or if you're a plant or a fungus or whatnot, all of those different organisms have DNA that create the blueprints of what it takes to create that organism. And we'll actually look at how that actually happens in chapters 9 and 10. All right, that's the end of chapter 3.